300 guests, $50,000 in white orchids, one missing groom. When the antique clock in the bridal suite struck 3, Audrey didn't weep. She adjusted her veil. In the ruthless world of high society, a cancelled wedding wasn't a tragedy. It was blood in the water. She was prepared to walk down that aisle and face the wolves alone. But the man waiting at the altar wasn't the coward who ran. It was the man the entire city feared. And he was looking right at her. The bridal suite at St. Patrick's Cathedral smelled of hairspray, nervous sweat, and dying freesias. Audrey Hayes sat perfectly still in a high-backed velvet chair. She stared at the Cartier wall clock. The gold minute hand snapped precisely onto the 3. It was 15 minutes past the hour. Across the room, her father Arthur was losing his mind. He paced the length of the Persian rug, his bespoke tuxedo wrinkling at the elbows as he jammed his phone against his ear. His face had cycled from a flushed crimson to a sickly, chalky white over the last 10 minutes. "What do you mean his phone is off?" Arthur barked into the receiver. He stopped pacing, his chest heaving. "Liam, you are his best man. You are supposed to put him in the car and bring him here. I don't care if he had cold feet. Put him in a headlock and drag him to the altar." Arthur pulled the phone away, staring at the screen as if it had bitten him. He hung up. Sasha Audrey's maid of honor stood frozen by the vanity. She held a crystal glass of champagne that had gone warm 10 minutes ago. She looked at Audrey, her eyes wide, with a pity that Audrey found infinitely more suffocating than the 50 pounds of raw silk and lace currently crushing her ribs. "Dad!" Audrey said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the room's chaotic hum. "Preston isn't coming. He has to come," Arthur snapped, wiping a bead of sweat from his temple. "The Harringtons are sitting in the front row. The mayor is 4 rows back. The entire board of directors for the shipping conglomerate is out there. If this wedding doesn't happen, the merger dies. If the merger dies, we are bankrupt by Tuesday." Audrey looked down at her hands. Her fingers were clad in sheer elbow-length gloves. They were perfectly steady. She found that mildly surprising. She had spent the last 8 months preparing to become Preston Harrington's wife. It was a transaction. He got her family's legacy and pedigree. Her father got the Harrington cash injection to save his failing freight business. She didn't love Preston. He was a man who wore too much cologne, complained about the temperature of his soup, and looked at other women when he thought Audrey wasn't paying attention. But a deal was a deal, and Preston had just broken it. A timid knock sounded at the heavy oak door. It creaked open, revealing a pale, trembling wedding planner, holding a clipboard to her chest like a shield. "Mr. Hayes," she whispered, "the organist has looped the prelude 4 times. The guests are—" "They're starting to murmur." "What should I tell them?" Arthur looked like a man standing on the gallows watching the lever pull. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Audrey stood up. The rustle of her gown sounded violently loud in the quiet room. She walked over to the gilded mirror, checking the pins in her hair. Not a single strand was out of place. Her makeup was flawless. She looked exactly like a woman about to secure a multi-million-dollar empire. "Tell the organist to cue my music," Audrey said. The wedding planner blinked. "I'm sorry, Miss Hayes, but there is no groom." "I am aware," Audrey replied, turning away from the glass. She grabbed her bouquet of white orchids from the vanity. The stems were cold and damp. "But the Hayes family hosted this event. My father paid for the champagne. My father paid for the caviar. I will not sneak out the back door of this church like a thief. If Preston Harrington lacks the spine to face this crowd, I will do it for him." "Audrey, are you insane?" Arthur grabbed her arm. His grip was entirely too tight. "You can't walk out there alone. Do you know what they'll say? Do you know the humiliation? They will say Preston Harrington is a coward. Audrey said, her voice dropping to a harsh, flat register. She pulled her arm out of his grasp. And they will say Audrey Hayes stood tall. Now offer me your arm, Father. We have a walk to make. Arthur stared at her. For a second, he looked like he might argue, but the sheer, cold finality in his daughter's eyes silenced him. He swallowed hard, adjusted his cuffs, and offered his elbow. Sasha quickly moved forward, fumbling to adjust the train of Audrey's dress. Audrey, she whispered, her voice cracking. You don't have to do this. Yes, I do, Audrey said. She looked straight ahead at the thick oak doors leading to the nave. Open them. The heavy doors parted. The sound of the cathedral hit Audrey like a physical wave. 300 people murmuring created a low, buzzing drone that reverberated off the vaulted stone ceilings. Then the organist saw her. The drone of the prelude abruptly shifted, crashing into the heavy dramatic chords of the bridal march. The murmurs died. 300 heads turned. Audrey stepped into the light. The cathedral was a cavern of stained glass, and shadows cut by the harsh glare of camera flashes from the press corralled at the back. She felt the immediate collective intake of breath from the congregation. They saw her. Then they looked past her toward the altar. It was empty. Audrey kept her chin parallel to the floor. She took her first step down the long crimson runner. Beside her, her father felt like a statue she was dragging forward. He was trembling. Audrey focused on the rhythm. Step. Pause. Step. Pause. She watched the faces of high society register what was happening. It was a brutal, real-time study in human nature. In the back rows there was confusion. In the middle rows, realization dawned, followed by sharp, vicious whispers behind gloved hands. By the time she reached the front rows, she saw the unvarnished pity. She hated the pity most of all. On the right side of the aisle sat the Harrington family. Preston's father, Richard, sat stiffly in his pew, his jaw clenched so tight it looked ready to fracture. Preston's mother was staring at her lap, a deep flush creeping up her neck. They knew. They had known before she walked out. Audrey reached the steps of the altar. The priest, a silver-haired man who had baptized her 26 years ago, stood at the podium. He looked terrified. He clutched his Bible with white-knuckled hands, his eyes darting frantically between Audrey and the empty space to her left. Arthur let go of her arm. He gave her a desperate, pleading look, begging her to turn around. Audrey ignored him. She stepped up alone and faced the priest. The organ music swelled to its final resounding chord. Then silence. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind of quiet that precedes a car crash. Audrey stood there clutching her orchids, feeling the weight of 300 stares burning into her back. She didn't know what her next move was. She had made her point. She had shown them she wouldn't hide. But now the reality of the empty space beside her began to set in. The cold marble floor seemed to tilt slightly beneath her heels. A single cough echoed from the back of the room. Then a sound cut through the tension. It was a sharp, heavy thud. The massive oak doors at the entrance of the cathedral hadn't just been opened. They had been shoved. Audrey didn't turn around immediately. She watched the faces of the guests in the front rows. She watched Richard Harrington's head snap toward the back of the church. She saw the blood drain entirely from his face. She watched the mayor sitting 4 rows back, physically, shrink down into his pew. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The pity evaporated, replaced entirely by a thick, palpable dread. Audrey finally turned her head. Walking down the aisle was a man who did not belong in this room. He wore a black suit, but it wasn't the uniform-rented tuxedo of the groomsmen. It was bespoke cut perfectly, to a broad, athletic frame. He wore a dark tie. No boutonniere. It was Vincent Carmine. Audrey recognized him instantly, though she had never formally met him. Everyone in the city knew who Vincent Carmine was. They didn't speak his name at cocktail parties. They whispered it behind closed doors. He controlled the ports. He controlled the unions. Men who crossed his family had a habit of taking sudden, undocumented trips abroad. He was a ghost in the financial district and a king on the docks. Vincent walked with a slow, deliberate cadence. His footsteps were the only sound in the cathedral. 2 men in dark suits had stopped at the entrance, standing like stone sentinels by the doors. Vincent walked alone. His face was hard angles and shadows, a faint, jagged scar cutting through the end of his left eyebrow. His dark eyes didn't sweep the crowd. He didn't look at the Harringtons. He didn't look at the priest. He was looking directly at Audrey. Her breath caught a sharp snag in the back of her throat. For a brief, irrational second, she thought he was there to collect a debt, to kill her father right there in the pew. But Vincent didn't stop at Arthur. He bypassed the front row entirely. He stepped up onto the altar. He stopped precisely in the spot where Preston was supposed to stand. Vincent turned to face her. He was close enough that Audrey could smell him. There was no overwhelming wave of designer cologne like Preston wore. Vincent smelled of cold winter air, expensive wool, and a faint trace of tobacco. He stood perfectly still, dwarfing her in height, a solid wall of dark fabric and quiet menace. The silence in the cathedral was absolute. No one breathed. "You're shaking, Miss Hayes," Vincent said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that didn't carry past the altar. Audrey tightened her grip on her bouquet. "I am standing before 300 people who came to watch a train wreck, Mr. Carmine. Forgive me if my nerves are slightly frayed." A faint, humorless smile touched the corner of his mouth. "You walked out here anyway. It takes a certain kind of spine to face down a room full of vultures." "What do you want?" she whispered, glancing nervously at the priest, who looked like he was on the verge of cardiac arrest. "I heard your groom took a sudden flight to Zurich," Vincent murmured, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "Left you with a rapidly decaying shipping company and a public relations disaster. A desperate position for your father. If you're here to buy my father's ships for pennies on the dollar, you picked a hell of a time to negotiate. I don't want the ships," Vincent said flatly. "I want the legitimate access they provide. My family requires a clean, unimpeachable front. Your father's company has the pedigree. I have the capital to erase his debts by midnight." Audrey stared at him, her mind racing, struggling to pass the cold logic of his words against the surreal setting of a church altar. "He would never do business with you. You're a criminal," Vincent supplied easily. "Yes, but your father is a bankrupt man. By tomorrow he'll be a beggar. I am offering a merger, a permanent one." Audrey's breath hitched. She looked at the empty space between them. "You're out of your mind." "Look at the front row, Audrey." He used her first name effortlessly, stripping away the formality. She shifted her gaze. The Harrington family sat in stunned silence. Preston's father looked pale, angry, but deeply afraid. They were watching a hostile takeover happen in the house of God. "Preston humiliated you," Vincent said, his voice dropping an octave, intimate and dangerous. "He made you a punchline. Marry me right now and you won't be a punchline. You'll be the untouchable wife of the most powerful man in this city. Your father's legacy survives. I get my clean shipping lanes. It's a business transaction, just like the one you came here to finalize today. Only I actually showed up." Audrey looked back into Vincent's eyes. They were cold, assessing, completely devoid of romance. He wasn't saving her. He was utilizing her. It was cynical. It was ruthless. It was exactly what she needed. She didn't want to go back to her father's crumbling estate. She didn't want to spend the next 5 years answering sympathetic questions from women who secretly despised her. She looked at Vincent Carmine, a man who lived in violence and operated in the shadows, and realized he was offering her the only armor strong enough to survive this room. "My father stays on the board," Audrey whispered. "In an advisory capacity. He keeps his office and his title. I run the lanes," Vincent countered smoothly. "No illegal cargo on the Hayes freighters. If you need to move contraband, you use your own rust buckets. My family name stays clean." Vincent's eyes narrowed a fraction. He studied her face, perhaps surprised by the speed of her calculation. "Agreed." Audrey took a slow, steadying breath. The corset was still tight, but she suddenly felt like she could breathe again. She nodded once. A sharp, definitive motion. Vincent didn't smile, but a glint of genuine approval flashed in his dark eyes. He turned his head toward the terrified, silver-haired man behind the podium. "Father," Vincent said, his voice now loud enough to carry to the first few rows. "You may begin." The priest opened his mouth, closed it, and looked at Arthur Hayes in the front row. Arthur was gripping the wooden pew so hard his knuckles were stark white. He looked from his daughter to the Mafia boss standing beside her, realizing exactly what was happening. He opened his mouth to object, but Vincent shifted his weight just slightly. A subtle, dangerous realignment. Arthur closed his mouth and lowered his eyes. "Dearly beloved." The priest choked out his voice, trembling violently. The ceremony was a blur of rapid, panicked Latin and English. The priest skipped the homily. He skipped the readings. He rushed straight to the vows, desperate to get the dangerous man out of his church. "Do you, Audrey?" The priest swallowed hard. "Take this man." "I do," Audrey said. Her voice was clear, ringing out over the silent congregation. "And do you—" The priest didn't even know Vincent's full name. "Do you take this woman?" "I do," Vincent said. "The rings," the priest whispered. Audrey froze. She didn't have a ring for him. The ring Preston was supposed to give her was in Liam's pocket, halfway to the airport. Vincent reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a heavy antique gold band. It looked old. It looked worn. He reached out and took Audrey's left hand. His skin was warm, his fingers calloused. It was a jarring contrast to the soft, sweaty hands of the men she usually dealt with. He slid the ring onto her finger. It was slightly too big, but it rested heavy against her knuckle. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the priest said, stepping back from the podium as if it might catch fire. "You may kiss the bride." Audrey looked up at Vincent. This wasn't in the negotiation. Vincent didn't hesitate. He stepped into her space. He lifted a hand, his thumb lightly brushing the line of her jaw, tilting her face upward. He leaned down. It wasn't a sweeping, romantic kiss. It was a seal on a contract. His lips pressed against hers, firm, warm, and entirely steady. For a fraction of a second, amidst the madness, the terror, and the blinding camera flashes that suddenly erupted from the back of the church, Audrey felt anchored. Vincent broke the kiss. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. Then he offered her his arm. Audrey looped her arm through his. They turned together, facing the sea of shocked, terrified faces. Audrey Hayes had walked down the aisle, a sacrificial lamb. She was walking back up it as a queen of the underworld. The heavy cathedral doors swung shut behind them, severing the stunned silence of the nave. Instantly, the outside world erupted. The stone steps of St. Patrick's were swarming. Word of the groom's desertion had leaked to the press 20 minutes ago, but the identity of his replacement had just hit the scanners. Flashbulbs went off in a blinding, aggressive strobe effect. Reporters shouted their voices, a tangled, indistinguishable roar over the rumble of Manhattan traffic. Audrey squinted against the harsh white light. She felt a momentary urge to shrink back into the shadows of the vestibule. Vincent didn't miss a beat. His hand slid from the crook of her arm to the small of her back. The pressure was firm, a physical command to keep moving. "Eyes forward," he said, his voice brushing against her ear. "Don't look at the cameras. Don't cover your face. You have nothing to hide." She obeyed. She kept her chin level and fixed her gaze on the black, armored Maybach idling at the curb. 4 men in identical dark suits materialized from the crowd. They didn't shout or push. They moved with a terrifying synchronized efficiency, using their broad shoulders to carve a path through the throngs of desperate photographers. One of the men, a tall, heavily scarred enforcer with a broken nose, opened the rear door of the Maybach. Vincent guided her in first. Gathering the massive, cumbersome skirts of her raw silk gown, Audrey folded herself into the cavernous back seat. The leather was cool and smelled of fresh polish. Vincent slid in beside her. The heavy door slammed shut, cutting off the frantic shouting of the press like a guillotine. The silence inside the cabin was absolute, insulated by 3 inches of bulletproof glass. The driver didn't wait for an instruction. The Maybach pulled away smoothly, merging into the chaotic flow of Fifth Avenue. Audrey stared straight ahead at the privacy partition separating them from the front seats. The adrenaline that had kept her spine steel straight during the ceremony was beginning to recede, leaving a cold, hollow ache in its wake. Her ribs throbbed against the boning of her corset. She looked down at her left hand. The antique gold band sat heavy on her ring finger. It looked entirely foreign against her pale skin. "You can take the veil off," Vincent said. He was looking out his window, watching the city blur past. "The performance is over." Audrey reached up with trembling fingers. She fumbled with the intricate pearl pins Sasha had spent an hour securing. It took a quiet, frustrating minute, but she finally pulled the heavy tool free. She dropped the veil onto the floorboard. She turned to look at the man sitting beside her. Up close, in the sterile light of the street lamps passing overhead, he looked even less like a savior. The faint scar through his eyebrow gave his face a perpetually hard edge. He wasn't wearing a wedding band. He hadn't brought one for himself. "Where are we going?" she asked. Her voice sounded thin, stripped of the bravado she had summoned at the altar. "My estate in Kings Point." Vincent replied, finally turning his head to look at her. "Your father's house will be surrounded by the press within the hour. The Harringtons will likely send their lawyers there by morning to try and salvage the wreckage of the merger they just blew up. You need to be unreachable." "My father is going to panic," Audrey said, leaning her head back against the headrest. She closed her eyes. "He doesn't do well with vacuums of power. If he can't control a narrative, he drinks. Let him drink. My accountants are currently wiring $70 million into the Hayes Freight operating accounts. That will sober him up." Audrey opened her eyes and snapped her head toward him. $70 million. That was the debt load threatening your bankruptcy, was it not? Vincent asked mildly. It was 65. She corrected her mind, struggling to process the sheer velocity of his actions. "And you didn't even review the ledgers. You just bought a toxic company blind. I didn't buy a company. I bought a logistics network. And I didn't buy it blind. I have known the exact decimal point of your father's debt for 6 months. Vincent shifted slightly, resting his elbow on the center console. I also knew Preston Harrington was hemorrhaging money in unregulated offshore accounts. He was never going to save your father. He was going to use your shipping lanes to smuggle illicit goods to cover his own margins. When the feds eventually cracked down, he was going to let Arthur take the fall." Audrey felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Preston. The coward who complained about lukewarm soup was running a shadow syndicate, and he was going to let her family burn for it. "How do you know that?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Because he tried to use my docs to do it," Vincent said flatly. "I told him no. I told him if he moved one crate of unvetted cargo through my territory, I would put him in the river. Audrey stared at him, horror mingling with a sudden vicious clarity. That's why he ran. He realized this morning that I had acquired the debt on the Harrington estate. Vincent confirmed his expression, completely devoid of sympathy. He didn't have cold feet, Audrey. He had a survival instinct. He caught a private flight to Switzerland at noon. She let out a sharp, breathless laugh. It wasn't funny. It was the darkest, most pathetic punchline she had ever heard. She had spent a year agonizing over a loveless marriage to save her father, and the man playing her savior had been building the gallows. "So you let him run," Audrey said, piecing the puzzle together. "You let him abandon me at the altar, creating a public disaster, so you could step in and look like a legitimate investor, saving a legacy family. I needed the Hayes shipping lanes. I need clean, federally inspected routes to move legitimate goods. My family is transitioning out of certain historical ventures. We are going entirely legitimate. To do that, I needed a name with a century of clean history. Hayes Freight was the only target." Vincent held her gaze, offering no apologies. "I didn't create your disaster, Audrey. I just capitalized on it. You used me. I married you. I paid your father's debts. I secured your legacy." Vincent's eyes darkened, locking onto hers with an intensity that made the air in the car feel suddenly thin. "You are not a victim here. You walked down that aisle knowing Preston was gone. You stood at that altar because you refused to lose. We are the same, you and I. We do what is required." Audrey looked away, staring down at the heavy gold ring. He was right. She hadn't married him out of coercion. She had made a cold, calculated choice to survive. "No illegal cargo," she repeated, her voice hard. "You promised. The Hayes name stays clean." "My word is my bond, Mrs. Carmine," Vincent said quietly. Hearing the new title sent a strange, involuntary shiver down her spine. She didn't correct him. She simply turned her head, watching the Manhattan skyline fade into the distance, wondering exactly what kind of cage she had just locked herself inside. The Carmine estate sat at the end of a private winding road in Kings Point, hidden behind 10-foot-high wrought-iron gates and a dense perimeter of old-growth pines. It wasn't a gaudy McMansion or a Gothic castle. It was a sprawling, brutalist structure of dark stone steel and floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass overlooking the Long Island Sound. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress. The Maybach rolled to a halt in the circular driveway. The heavy front doors of the house were already open. A man stood on the stone portico waiting for them. He was older than Vincent, with silver hair clipped tight to his scalp and a tailored suit that didn't quite hide the bulk of a shoulder holster. Vincent stepped out of the car and offered Audrey his hand. She ignored it, gathering her skirts and stepping out into the biting night air on her own. Vincent dropped his hand without a word. "Elias," Vincent said, nodding to the older man. "Boss," Elias replied. His eyes flicked to Audrey, taking in the massive wedding dress and the antique ring on her finger. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who had seen 1,000 strange things and catalogued this as just another Tuesday. "The wire transfer to Hayes Freight cleared 10 minutes ago. The press is currently camped out at Arthur's townhouse. We sent a detail to keep them off his lawn." "Good. Have the legal team draft the merger documents by morning," Vincent said, walking past Elias into the house. Audrey followed her heels, clicking sharply against the polished slate floor. The interior of the house matched the exterior. It was vast, impeccably clean, and entirely devoid of warmth. There were no photographs on the walls. The furniture was sleek, modern, and looked profoundly uncomfortable. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic crashing of the waves against the seawall outside. Your bags from the hotel were collected, Elias said, trailing behind them. They are in the master suite. Audrey stopped walking. She turned to look at Vincent. Her exhaustion was suddenly replaced by a sharp, defensive spike of adrenaline. We need to establish boundaries, Audrey said, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous foyer. Vincent stopped halfway up the floating steel staircase. He looked back at her. Go on. This is a business arrangement, a merger. I am not sleeping in your bed. She held her ground, clutching the heavy silk of her dress. Elias stood motionless by the door, completely silent, pretending he was part of the architecture. Vincent's expression didn't change. He looked down at her, his dark eyes slowly tracing the rigid posture of her shoulders, the defiance in her jaw, and the sheer absurdity of the massive white gown in his dark, sterile hallway. The master suite is a compound of 3 rooms, Vincent said evenly. You will take the east wing. I sleep in the west. We share a private corridor, but the doors lock from the inside. Will that suffice? Audrey blinked, slightly disarmed by his immediate concession. Yes. Good. Elias, secure the perimeter for the night. Vincent turned and continued up the stairs. Come along, Audrey. It's been a long day. She followed him up to the 2nd floor. He led her down a wide, dimly lit hallway and pushed open a heavy mahogany door. The east wing of the master suite was stunning, dominated by a massive wall of glass facing the black ocean. Her leather overnight bags sat neatly at the foot of a king-sized bed. A fire was already burning in the gas fireplace, casting a warm, flickering light across the hardwood floor. Vincent stood in the doorway, making no move to cross the threshold. If you need anything, there is a panel by the bed to call the kitchen. Breakfast is at 7. He began to pull the door shut. Wait, Audrey said. The word slipped out before her pride could catch it. Vincent paused, pushing the door back open. He raised an eyebrow. Audrey let out a long, frustrated breath. She turned her back to him. My maid of honor was supposed to help me out of this. The corset laces up the back. There are 40 tiny buttons covering the zipper. I can't reach them. Silence stretched in the room. Audrey closed her eyes, hating the vulnerability of the request. She was asking the head of the city's most feared crime syndicate to play lady's maid. She heard the soft click of the door closing, followed by the quiet thud of his footsteps crossing the hardwood. He stopped directly behind her. Hold your hair up, Vincent instructed quietly. Audrey gathered the heavy pinned mass of her hair and lifted it off her neck. Vincent's hands touched her spine. She flinched involuntarily. His fingers were warm and surprisingly gentle as they navigated the delicate lace of her gown. He didn't speak. She could hear the faint, methodical pop of the tiny silk buttons slipping through their loops. It was a profoundly intimate act, stripped entirely of romance. It was mechanical, precise, and efficient. As his fingers moved lower, tracking down the line of her spine, she felt the rigid boning of the corset loosen. The crushing pressure on her ribs finally gave way. She took her first full deep breath in 12 hours. The zipper is clear, Vincent said. His voice was close, vibrating softly in the quiet room. He didn't linger. He stepped back immediately, putting a safe, sterile distance between them. Audrey let her hair fall back down. She clutched the front of the dress to keep it from slipping off her shoulders. She turned to face him. Thank you, she said, her voice tight. Get some sleep, Audrey, Vincent said. He turned and walked back toward the door. Tomorrow we go to war. The door clicked shut behind him. The lock engaged with a heavy metallic thud. Audrey stood alone in the firelight, the heavy silk pooling around her feet, realizing that for the first time in her life, she felt completely terrified and entirely safe at the exact same time. Audrey woke to the smell of black coffee and the sound of relentless driving rain hitting the glass. She sat up in the massive bed. For a fraction of a second, Her brain expected the familiar floral wallpaper of her childhood bedroom. Instead, she saw the stark grey stone and the churning, slate-coloured ocean beyond the window. The events of yesterday crashed down on her in a heavy, suffocating wave. The empty altar, the gold ring, the Maybach. She threw off the heavy duvet. She hadn't brought clothes meant for a Mafia compound. Her bags were packed for a 2-week honeymoon in the Maldives. She bypassed the silk sundresses and pulled on a pair of wide-leg cashmere lounge pants and an oversized white button-down sweater. She walked out of her suite, navigating the quiet, labyrinthine hallways until she found the kitchen. It was an industrial-grade space of stainless steel and black marble. Vincent was sitting at the massive island. He wore a dark, tailored suit, though he had discarded the jacket, and rolled the cuffs of his white shirt up to his forearms. A tablet was propped up in front of him, and a stack of morning newspapers sat on the counter. He looked up as she walked in. "Coffee is in the pot." Audrey walked over to the machine, grabbed a heavy ceramic mug and poured it black. She took a sip. It was strong, bitter, and exactly what she needed. She carried the mug to the island and sat on the stool opposite him. She glanced at the newspapers. The front page of the City Chronicle featured a massive high-definition photo of her and Vincent standing at the altar. Vincent was in the middle of sliding the ring onto her finger. The headline was brutally large: "Mobe ties the knot carmine. Syndicate acquires high society heiress." "Charming," Audrey muttered, pulling the paper toward her. The Times was slightly more restrained, Vincent noted, scrolling through his tablet without looking up. They went with a simple analysis of the financial implications. The market is confused. Hayes freight stock plummeted at the opening bell, then rallied an hour ago, when my holding company officially filed the debt clearance documents. Audrey scanned the article. They painted her as a tragic, brainless pawn sold off by a desperate father to settle a blood debt. They painted Vincent as a predator who had stormed a church to collect his prize. Her phone, sitting on the counter where Elias had placed it earlier, began to vibrate violently. It was the 10th time it had gone off since she entered the kitchen. She looked at the screen. Arthur Hayes. "He's been calling since 6, Vincent said finally, looking up from his tablet. "I told Elias not to answer it. You need to handle him." Audrey stared at the vibrating phone. Her father had almost cost her everything. He had forced her toward Preston, ignored the red flags, and nearly drove their legacy into a federal indictment. She picked up the phone and swiped to accept the call. She pressed the speaker button and set it down on the marble counter between her and Vincent. "Audrey." Arthur's voice was ragged, frantic, and entirely too loud. "Audrey, thank God. Where are you? The police are outside. The press is on the lawn. Are you safe? Did he hurt you?" Audrey took a slow sip of her coffee. She kept her eyes on Vincent, who watched her with a quiet, analytical intensity. "I am perfectly fine, Father," Audrey said, her tone smooth and dangerously calm. "I am at Vincent's home, and you need to lower your voice." "What are you talking about, Audrey? You have to get out of there. The lawyers are drafting an annulment right now. We can claim duress. We can claim he threatened us. Preston's father called Richard Harrington can rot." Audrey interrupted, her voice snapping like a whip. The silence on the other end of the line was immediate and profound. "Listen to me very carefully, Dad," Audrey continued, leaning forward, her voice dropping to a cold, authoritative register she had never used with him before. Preston was running an illegal smuggling ring. He abandoned the merger because Vincent cornered him. If I hadn't married Vincent yesterday, you wouldn't just be bankrupt today. You would be facing federal RICO charges by the end of the week. That's impossible," Arthur stammered. "Preston is a Harrington. They are a pillar of... They are cowards who tried to use our company as a shield," Audrey corrected ruthlessly. "Vincent cleared your $65 million debt at midnight. The bank owns nothing. We are solvent. Audrey, he is a criminal. The Carmine family is our new board of directors. Audrey finished for him. The deal is done. You keep your office, you keep your title, but you do not make a single logistical decision without running it through Vincent's office first. Do you understand me? Arthur sounded like he was struggling to breathe. You are my daughter. You can't speak to me like this. I am the woman who stood alone in front of 300 people to save your reputation while you shook in your pew. Audrey said, her voice completely stripped of empathy. I earned the right to speak however I want. Do not speak to the press. Do not answer calls from the Harringtons. Go to your office, sit at your desk and wait for instructions. She reached out and tapped the red button on the screen, cutting the call dead. The kitchen was silent, save for the rain hammering against the glass. Audrey picked up her coffee mug. Her hand was shaking slightly, the adrenaline of the confrontation catching up to her. She took another sip, trying to steady herself. She looked up. Vincent was staring at her. The cold, impassive mask he usually wore had cracked slightly. There was a glimmer of something sharp and undeniable in his dark eyes. It looked dangerously close to respect. Remind me never to negotiate with you without a lawyer present, Vincent murmured. You got what you paid for Mr. Carmine, Audrey said, setting the mug down. A legitimate front. Now how do we convince the world that this marriage isn't just a hostile takeover? Vincent reached out and tapped the front page of the City Chronicle, right on the photo of them at the altar. We don't hide, Vincent said, his voice dropping into a low predatory hum. Tonight is the mayor's charity gala at the plaza. The Harringtons will be there. The board will be there. We are going to walk in through the front door, Mrs. Carmine, and we are going to show them exactly who runs this city now. Audrey did not wear white. She had played the Virgin Sacrifice yesterday. Tonight, she was the executioner. She chose a vintage floor-length gown of liquid black silk. It had a high neckline, long sleeves, and an open back that dipped dangerously low, exposing the sharp, tense lines of her spine. It was armor masquerading as couture. She pulled her hair back into a severe, polished knot. No diamonds, no pearls. The only jewelry she wore was the heavy, scarred gold band on her left hand. When she walked down the floating steel staircase, Vincent was waiting in the foyer. He wore a midnight blue tuxedo that absorbed the light in the cavernous room. He looked up. His eyes tracked the long, unbroken line of the black dress lingering for a fraction of a second on the gold ring before meeting her gaze. He didn't offer a compliment. Compliments were cheap. Instead, he adjusted his cuffs and said, "Elias has the car ready." It was the highest form of approval he could offer. The drive to Manhattan was silent. The rain had cleared, leaving the city slick and glittering under the streetlights. As the Maybach turned onto Fifth Avenue, the Plaza Hotel loomed ahead. The entrance was a chaotic sea of velvet ropes, black umbrellas, and a massive press corral. "They are going to look for weakness," Vincent said, staring out the window. "They will watch where you put your hands. They will watch how close we stand. High society is just a cartel with better table manners. If they smell blood, they will strike." "Let them," Audrey replied, her voice cool and flat. She snapped the clasp of her clutch shut. "I grew up in these rooms, Vincent. I know how these people bleed." The car stopped. Elias opened the door. The flashbulbs were blinding, an aggressive, strobing assault that made the air feel hot. Vincent stepped out first. He turned, offering his hand. Audrey placed hers in his. His grip was entirely solid, a heavy anchor in a turbulent sea. She stepped onto the wet pavement. The shouts from the press were deafening. "Audrey, where is Preston Vincent? Is this a hostile takeover? Audrey, did your father force you?" They ignored every single word. Vincent placed his hand flat against the bare skin of her lower back. His touch was a jolt of heat against the cold night air. He guided her up the steps past the frantic reporters and through the revolving brass doors. The grand ballroom was a spectacle of crystal chandeliers, gold leaf, and 10,000 white roses. A string quartet played in the corner, though the music was nearly drowned out by the low, continuous hum of 300 wealthy people talking. When Audrey and Vincent stepped through the archway, the hum died. It didn't fade out gracefully. It stopped like a record dragged off a turntable. Heads snapped toward the entrance. Champagne flutes hovered inches from mouths. 300 pairs of eyes locked onto the Mafia boss and the heiress. Vincent didn't break stride. He guided Audrey down the carpeted steps and walked directly into the center of the room. He didn't avoid the stares. He challenged them. Audrey kept her chin perfectly level. She felt the collective suffocating weight of their judgment. Yesterday these people had pitied her. Today they were terrified of her. She found she vastly preferred the terror. A waiter approached with a silver tray. Vincent took 2 glasses of champagne. He handed one to Audrey. "To the wolves," Vincent murmured, raising his glass a fraction of an inch. "May they choke," Audrey whispered back. She took a sip. They didn't have to wait long. A crowd parted near the ice sculpture, and Richard Harrington marched toward them. He was not alone. Flanking him were 2 men Audrey recognized as the senior partners of the Harrington legal team. Richard's face was a mottled, unhealthy red. He looked like a man who had not slept, eaten, or stopped drinking since yesterday afternoon. He stopped 3 feet from them, entirely ignoring Vincent. He glared at Audrey. "You foolish, arrogant girl." Richard spat. His voice was a harsh, raspy whisper, desperate to keep the scene quiet while inflicting maximum damage. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Preston steps away for a momentary crisis, and you sell your family to a thug to save face." Audrey didn't blink. She took another sip of her champagne, swallowing slowly. "A momentary crisis. Richard, is that what we're calling a federal evasion flight to Zurich?" Richard flinched. The red in his cheeks drained into a sickly grey. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know Preston's offshore accounts are bleeding out," Audrey said, her voice dropping into a register of pure, frozen glass. "I know he tried to run illicit cargo to cover his margins. I know he left me at an altar to take the fall for a federal indictment. And I know that if you speak to me in that tone again, I will let my husband explain the consequences to you." She shifted her weight, stepping just a fraction of an inch closer to Vincent. Vincent hadn't said a word. He hadn't needed to. He simply stood there, a massive, immovable wall of dark authority, watching Richard bleed out on the marble floor. Richard's eyes finally flicked to Vincent. The lawyer on Richard's left actually took a physical step backward. "The Hayes lanes are closed to you, Richard," Vincent said. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried the lethal crushing weight of an avalanche. "Your son is exiled. If he sets foot in this state again, I will not call the police. I will handle it personally. And if you ever approach my wife again, I will dismantle your company piece by piece and sell the scrap to your competitors." Richard opened his mouth, but his throat worked uselessly. He looked at Audrey, searching for the obedient, quiet girl who was supposed to marry his son. She was gone. In her place was a woman forged in ice. Richard turned on his heel and walked away, his lawyers practically jogging to keep up with his retreat. Audrey let out a slow, controlled breath. Her hand was shaking slightly, the champagne rippling in the crystal flute. Vincent reached out, his large fingers wrapped over hers, steadying the glass. "You handled him," Vincent said quietly. "He was easy," Audrey muttered, staring at Richard's retreating back. "He's just a bully in a tailored suit." And what am I? Audrey looked up at him. The ambient light of the chandeliers caught the jagged scar on his brow. You are the man the bullies are afraid of. By 11 o'clock, the air in the ballroom felt thin and recycled. The endless parade of fake smiles, trembling handshakes, and calculated small talk had ground Audrey's nerves to a frayed wire. Vincent had been pulled into a corner by a panicked city councilman, desperate to ensure his union funding wouldn't vanish under the new regime. Audrey set her empty glass on a passing tray and slipped through a set of heavy French doors leading out to the terrace. The night air was freezing, but it felt clean. She walked to the stone balustrade, leaning forward and looking down at the yellow cabs crawling along Central Park South. She closed her eyes, letting the cold wind strip the stifling heat of the gala from her skin. "It's a long drop, Mrs. Carmine." The voice came from the shadows near the edge of the terrace. It wasn't a guest. It lacked the polished boarding school cadence of the men inside. It was rough-stained with nicotine and cheap whiskey. Audrey turned slowly. A man stepped out from the alcove. He was heavily built, wearing a suit that didn't fit properly across his broad shoulders. He had a thick, broken nose and cold, dead eyes. "This terrace is private," Audrey said, her voice steady, despite the sudden icy spike of adrenaline in her chest. "Nothing is private anymore, sweetheart," the man said, taking a slow step toward her. "Your husband is making a mess. He bought your daddy's boats, which means he bought the roots. Roots that belong to Preston Harrington. Routes that Preston promised to my boss." Audrey backed up slightly, her hip pressing against the cold stone balustrade. "I don't know who you are. Name Sullivan. You tell Carmine that going legit is a cute PR stunt, but he doesn't get to choke out the O'Connor syndicate to do it. We have crates sitting in Dublin waiting for Hayes freighters. They better move by Friday." "My husband doesn't move illegal cargo," Audrey said, keeping her eyes locked on his hands. He was reaching into his jacket. "Then your husband is going to find out what happens when you starve a starving dog," Sullivan snarled, pulling a short, heavy steel baton from his coat. "Maybe we start by breaking his shiny new toy to send a message." He lunged. Audrey didn't scream. She threw her weight to the side, her black dress snapping violently in the wind. The baton smashed into the stone balustrade, exactly where her ribs had been a second before. Shards of rock exploded outward. Before Sullivan could pull back for a second swing, the French doors blew open. Vincent didn't yell. He didn't pull a weapon. He moved with a terrifying, absolute violence that Audrey couldn't entirely process. In 3 massive strides, he crossed the terrace. He caught Sullivan by the throat with his left hand. The momentum lifted the heavier man entirely off his feet. Sullivan gagged, dropping the baton, as he clawed desperately at the iron grip, crushing his windpipe. Vincent slammed him against the brick wall of the hotel. The sickening crack of Sullivan's skull hitting the masonry echoed sharply in the cold air. Sullivan slumped his eyes, rolling back, but Vincent didn't let go. He pinned the man to the wall, his face inches from Sullivan's ear. "You tell O'Connor," Vincent whispered, his voice a lethal demonic rasp, "that if a single one of his men breathes the same air as my wife again, I will burn his operation to the ground with him inside it. The Hayes routes are closed. If you want a war, you have one. Now get out of my sight before I throw you off this balcony." Vincent opened his hand. Sullivan collapsed onto the stone floor like a sack of wet cement. He gasped for air, coughing violently, blood leaking from the back of his head. He scrambled backward like a crab, found his feet, and stumbled toward the fire exit at the end of the terrace. The heavy metal door slammed shut. Silence fell over the terrace, broken only by the distant wail of a police siren. Vincent stood perfectly still for a moment, his chest heaving under his tuxedo shirt. He looked down at his hands, deliberately flexing his fingers before turning to look at Audrey. She was pressed against the balustrade, her hands gripping the stone edge. She was staring at him. She had known he was dangerous. She had read the articles. She had heard the whispers. But knowing it in the abstract and watching a man nearly get beaten to death in total silence were two entirely different things. Vincent took a step toward her. Then he stopped. The rigid, brutal posture of the Mafia boss cracked, revealing a sudden, stark hesitation. He thought she was terrified of him. "Audrey," he said, his voice stripped of its usual absolute control. She let go of the stone. She didn't run to the door. She walked directly toward him. She stopped inches away. She reached out her trembling fingers, brushing the lapel of his tuxedo. Her hand moved up, pressing against the heavy, rapidly beating pulse at the base of his throat. "Did he hurt you?" she asked. Vincent stared down at her, genuine shock registering in his dark eyes. He covered her hand with his own. His skin was cold, his knuckles grazed. "No. Who is O'Connor?" she demanded, her voice shaking not from fear of Vincent, but from the sudden, violent realization of the world she had married into. "A parasite who thought Preston was an easy mark," Vincent said quietly. He didn't pull her hand away. He held it against his chest. "I knew they would be angry. I didn't think they would be stupid enough to approach you at a public gala. They wanted to use me to hurt you. They failed," Vincent said, his jaw tightening. "I told you I would protect your family's name. I will protect you. I am sorry you had to see that." Audrey looked at the blood on the brick wall. Then she looked back into Vincent's eyes. "Don't apologize to me for keeping me alive, Vincent. I knew who you were when I took your hand at the altar. I'm not a child." A long, heavy breath escaped him. The tension in his shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. "We are leaving." He didn't guide her by the small of her back this time. He laced his fingers through hers. Their hands locked together, tightly, violently. They walked back through the ballroom, ignoring the stares, ignoring the murmurs, and walked out into the cold New York night. The house in Kings Point was entirely dark when they returned, save for the low security lights illuminating the perimeter. Elias had dismissed the staff. They walked into the kitchen in silence. The adrenaline had burned off on the long drive up the Long Island Expressway, leaving a heavy, exhausting ache in its place. Audrey kicked off her high heels. The black silk of her dress pooled around her bare feet on the slate floor. She walked over to the massive refrigerator, pulled out a bottle of cold water, and set it on the marble island. Vincent had taken off his tuxedo jacket, tossing it over the back of a leather stool. He stood by the sink, rolling up his sleeves. His knuckles on his left hand were bruised, the skin broken, and beginning to swell where he had slammed Sullivan into the brick. Audrey watched him turn on the faucet. He held his hand under the freezing water, his jaw clenched tight. She walked over to the stainless steel first aid box mounted near the pantry. She opened it, pulling out a bottle of antiseptic, a roll of gauze and medical tape. She carried them over to the sink. "Move," she said softly. Vincent looked at her, his eyes dark and guarded. "It's fine. It's just a scrape." "You are going to bleed on the marble, Vincent. Move." He shut off the water and turned to face her, leaning his hip against the counter. He held out his hand. Audrey took his wrist. His forearm was thick with muscle, covered in a faint dusting of dark hair and a matrix of old, faded scars. She didn't ask about them. She poured the antiseptic onto a cotton pad. "This is going to sting," she warned. "I've had worse," he muttered. She pressed the pad to his knuckles. Vincent didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He just stood there, looking down at the top of her head as she meticulously cleaned the broken skin. She worked with quiet efficiency, wrapping the white gauze around his large hand and securing it with tape. When she was finished, she didn't let go of his hand immediately. She ran her thumb lightly over the edge of the white bandage. "They won't stop, will they?" Audrey asked quietly, her eyes fixed on his hand. "O'Connor, the others. Because you are trying to walk away from the shadows, they are going to try and drag you back in. When you sit on a throne built on violence, people do not let you abdicate peacefully," Vincent said. His voice was a low rumble in the quiet kitchen. "The transition to legitimate business is going to take blood. I thought I could shield you from the worst of it by keeping this strictly as a corporate merger. I was wrong." Audrey finally looked up. "You can't shield me, Vincent. I'm your wife. My name is on the ledgers and my face is on the front page of the paper next to yours. I am a target now. If we treat this like a fake marriage, they will find the gaps and they will break us apart." Vincent's eyes darkened, locking onto hers. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt incredibly dense. He took a half step closer. "What are you saying, Audrey?" "I am saying the contract is void," she whispered. She didn't back away. She tipped her chin up, meeting his intense stare, without an ounce of hesitation. "You don't get to fight this war alone while I hide in the East Wing. If I am going to be Mrs. Carmine, then I am going to be your partner. In all of it. We don't play pretend anymore." Vincent stared at her. He saw the cold intellect that had outmaneuvered her father. He saw the iron spine that had faced down 300 laughing aristocrats. He saw a woman who had watched him nearly kill a man and had stepped closer instead of running away. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out with his unbandaged hand. His fingers brushed the side of her neck, sliding up into the hair at the nape of her neck. "A partner." Vincent murmured the word, tasting dangerous on his tongue. "In my world, loyalty isn't a line in a contract, Audrey. It is absolute. It is total. Once you step fully across this line, there is no going back to the polite society you came from. You will be mine. In every sense of the word." "I was never meant for polite society," Audrey said. Her voice didn't shake. "I was meant to survive." Vincent's gaze dropped to her mouth. The restraint he had shown in the bridal suite, the cold, mechanical distance he had maintained in the hallway, it all shattered. He pulled her in. The kiss was nothing like the one at the altar. It wasn't a public seal on a business deal. It was raw bruising and desperate. Audrey gasped against his mouth, her hands gripping the front of his shirt, pulling him closer. He tasted like cold rain and dark coffee. His large hand tangled in her hair, the other wrapping tightly around her waist, lifting her slightly off the floor, pressing her back against the edge of the marble island. She didn't feel afraid. She felt a terrifying, brilliant clarity. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathing heavily in the quiet room. He rested his forehead against hers. His eyes were entirely black in the dim light. "The East Wing is yours," Vincent whispered, roughly, his thumb stroking her jawline. "But you are not sleeping there tonight." Audrey looked into the eyes of the man the entire city feared knowing. She had just permanently bound herself to a monster to escape a cage. "No," she said softly, wrapping her arms around his neck. "I'm not." The war for the city was waiting for them at dawn. But tonight, they belonged to each other. Audrey thought she was making a cold, calculated business deal, but she just signed her soul over to a war she never saw coming. The fake marriage is over, and the real partnership built on blood ambition and undeniable heat has just begun. O'Connor's syndicate won't stop. But they are about to learn that the only thing deadlier than the Mafia boss is his new wife. What did you think of Audrey and Vincent's explosive first gala? Drop a comment below. If you loved this dark romance hit, like, share with your friends, and subscribe for the next thrilling story.